Welcome back, everyone. We've looked at Milan and the Viscontis and the Sforzas, and we've seen that individuals, even individuals from difficult backgrounds like Francesco Sforza, could rise a long way in Renaissance Italy. In a more fluid society, there were probably more opportunities than there'd been in the past. We've also seen the rise of, again, sort of this repeated theme of centralized government power. And now we're going to turn to the city of Florence, in many ways the center of the Renaissance. And so Florence is not a port city in the way that Venice and Genoa were, and these were the trading cities that became wealthy during the medieval period. But Florence becomes wealthy as a center of industry through the production of textiles. And after a medieval period that was a little bit turbulent, a little bit politically unstable, the city establishes a republican constitution in 1283. And this constitution removes nobles from positions of power within the city and instead concentrates power in the hands of an executive council called the Signoria. And this was made up of 9 members who served 2-month terms. And the Signoria was controlled by 2 other approving bodies, the Council of the People, made up of 300, and a Council of the Commune, made up of 200 people. So the way the system worked was the Signoria could propose new laws, but they had to be approved by these larger governing bodies. And so this was a way of making sure that the Signoria didn't make too many changes too quickly. In 1346, Edward III defaulted on loans he'd taken out from the Florentine banks to fight the Hundred Years' War. And this is also right around the time of the Black Death. So the middle of the 14th century is a very difficult period for Florence. The banks had been another way in which the city had become wealthy. A lot of those banks disintegrate when Edward defaults on the loans. Huge percentage of the city, up to 60%, we're not sure of the exact percentage, dies as a result of the Black Death. So this was an exceptionally difficult period for the city of Florence. It's made worse in the next generation when the Ciompi, these are the wool workers, revolt against the Signoria and revolt against the city. And so this is a revolt that's kind of similar to the peasants' revolt in England that we talked about last time, happens right around the same time. It's part of the economic fallout from the Black Death that lower paid workers in the society are able to agitate and protest for better wages. Then the city faces the prospect in 1402 of being conquered by Galeazzo Visconti, but is spared. So this brings us to the end of the history of Florence in the 14th century. So you can see that this was a difficult time period. 15th century for Florence, however, is going to be much more successful. This is going to be the period where the very famous Medici family come to power. And so the Medici are going to be highly influential in the history of Florence and the history of the Renaissance. They become popular in the city by opposing ongoing wars with Milan and instead working with Francesco Sforza to achieve peace, and by supporting more rights for the Ciompi, so for lesser guilds, non-textile manufacturing guilds who wanted some influence in the government of the city. And the Medici were were a family of wealthy bankers and merchants. They were led by a man named Cosmo De Medici. And so these are middle-class citizens who are growing up to exercise more influence in this society. And so Cosimo had expanded the Medici Bank. And one of the ways that he does this is that he establishes the Medici Bank as the main bank that was used by the papacy. So papacy is a great client to have. There's a lot of money that's coming into the papacy that the papacy is using. So this is a great client for the Medici. It makes them increasingly powerful and increasingly influential. Cosimo also marries into the Bardi family. Now, the Bardi family were an ancient, venerable banking family in Florence at the time, and the Medici and Cosimo, they were kind of up-and-comers. But the Bardi family, their bank had been one of the banks that had been ruined by the economic crisis in the middle of the 14th century. And so they're a family that has a lot of prestige, was kind of down on their luck. The Medici are an up-and-coming family. This enables Cosimo to make this marriage alliance. And the member of the Bardi family who he marries, Contessina, was a devoted wife and a mother, even to the illegitimate children that Cosimo fathered. And so Cosimo becomes a member of the Signoria, but people have become jealous of his success and suspicious of his influence by this point. And so he's blamed for a failed military campaign. And people say, this was someone who was in favor of peace. He's working to undermine this campaign. And initially, he's condemned to death. But that punishment is ameliorated, and instead, he is only exiled. However, his influence in the city is so powerful by this point that so much wealth and so much trade leaves the city when he leaves that eventually he's recalled. He's going to exercise this great influence in the city of Florence without, again, holding a position of political influence that comes with political responsibility. Instead, he's going to use his money and his influence behind the scenes to control the institutions of the Florentine Republic. So Florence is still outwardly a republic, but in many ways it's now being governed by Cosmo de Medici. And he is going to be someone who lives a very simple life, but was a great promoter of the arts. He promotes public libraries in Florence. He builds the Church of San Marco that you see here. He funds works of art, like this work of Fra Angelico, and the interior of these Renaissance churches. He's also famous for building the Medici Palace. And when he dies, over his grave in the cathedral in Florence, the Florentines grant him the title of Father of the Fatherland. And this was the same title that the Romans had given to Cicero. And so it's a sign of the great respect that Cosimo held in this society by the time he died. And he's seen as someone who was a businessman, but it shows us the influence of businessmen in this society, that despite the fact that he didn't hold a political position, despite the fact that he wasn't a king, he was very much able to guide the politics and culture of this society. And so it's not only through his work in government, but also in his promotion of the arts. I've spoken about the churches already, but also want to talk about the public library that he funded. This is the first public library in European history that we know of. And Cosimo used a lot of his money to fund the copying by hand still at this point, of the books that made up this library. I've included this picture here. This is pictures of the Medici Palace. I think this is a great analogy for the way that Cosmo Medici exercised his influence. Because on the outside, you can see it's a nice building. I'm sure all of us would be happy to have this as a house, but it's pretty simple on the outside. And in fact, originally, the architect who designed the palace made it really grand and looked like a palace of the most influential man in the city. And Cosmo said, no, it has to be very simple on the outside. But then when we get into the inside, you can see that here's where the bling is, here's where the wealth is. And so I think that's very reflective of the way that Cosimo operated, that on the outside, he lives this very simple lifestyle, but on the inside, he's using his wealth, he's using his resources to promote the art and beauty, as you can see here, but also to promote his political influence in the city. The next prominent Medici was Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was the grandson of Cosimo. And so Cosimo recognized that his grandson had a brilliant mind. He also recognized that his son, the father of Lorenzo, was in poor health, was unlikely to live a long life. And so instead, he invested his resources in giving Lorenzo a complete Renaissance education. After the death of Lorenzo's father in 1469, Lorenzo rises to prominence in the city of Florence, that he governs much more prominently than Cosimo did. So this is a difference in their styles, where Cosimo kind of liked to work behind the scenes. Lorenzo was much more putting on a show in terms of emphasizing that he was the one who was guiding the art and the politics of the city. And so Lorenzo is actually going to rework the government of Florence into a council of 70 members that he very much controls. Like his grandfather, Lorenzo is a great patron of the arts. You can see that in his villa here and in some of the pottery designs that he sponsored, that he provided the funding for these works. He was also a poet in his own right. This is where we see the development of the Renaissance. We see how one generation is a little different from the other. Whereas Cosimo only promoted this art, Lorenzo was actually an artist himself, was a creator of this art. Around 1490, the Medici's influence starts to decline a little bit along with their banking fortunes. And so it kind of comes to light that Lorenzo had carried out some less than secure loans. And so the Medici banking empire collapses in 1494. Lorenzo is reduced to embezzling state funds in order to prop up his family. This is the reverse of who the Medici want to style themselves. They want to style themselves as patrons of the city of Florence. And instead, they're seizing money from the city to line their own pockets. So this is a sign that there's a decline in the Medici fortunes as we come towards the end of the 15th century. Just before we move on, one of the things that's really cool about the Renaissance is that we have so much art and we have prominent individuals playing prominent roles in this period of history. And a lot of times we see these individuals represented in the art. That's because these individuals would fund works of art, and as a sign of gratitude, as a sign of respect, the artist would include them in these figures. So this is one over here. We have this image of the Madonna and Child by Botticelli, and the Madonna is one of the leading women in the Medici family. And over here, we have the adoration of Christ at Christmas time in the stable in Bethlehem, the adoration of the Christ child by who? By the Magi, by the kings. And who is the king who's depicted here? It is Cosmo de Medici, who's the model of the king. And again, I think this is very clever. Cosimo, not a king, of course, but acting like a king. But someone who presented himself in a way that was humble, presented himself as a public servant, and we see that here as well. And then over here in the corner, we have Lorenzo the Magnificent, who was said to be someone who was a great artist, a great promoter of art, but someone who was ugly in person. You can judge for yourselves whether or not you think he's ugly, but what's I think is really great about these portrayals is they give us a real sense. We don't have photographs, of course, at this point. But these give us a real sense of what these people might have looked like at the time. So that's all the material we're going to cover on the Italian city-states. What have we learned from the political history of the Renaissance? We've learned that this period is violent, that it's tumultuous, that it's uncertain. You can rise very high in political power. You can also lose that power very quickly. It means that being a good ruler means providing stability and supporting learning. If you can provide that stability, people are willing to allow you a little more power, a little more control, and remove some of the checks and balances that had prevented rulers from becoming tyrannical before. And so we have here again these two very important themes of the Renaissance: an increase in power and influence for individuals, also a centralization of political power. Hope you've enjoyed this material, and see you next week.